A dangerous education for me was a response to what I saw happening uh, when Trump was president, and the putting a lot of conservative judges on, um, appointing a lot of conservative judges. And I had been I guess, a feminist sort of my whole life. And I remember telling my daughters, it's a really slippery slope. Things can be taken away. You think you're fine and you aren't. And that comes from, again, my point of view as a historian, such as I am, of the way that women's powers is given and taken away. And I wanted to talk about particularly this idea that adoption was a viable alternative for everybody, because I don't think it is. And that's kind of where the idea came from, that and this idea that I'd read about the fact that they found DNA of women's children in their brains even when they were like in their 90s, and which said that the DNA, that if you're pregnant, even if you have a miscarriage or you abort that child, even if you never have the child, the DNA remains in your body. And they don't know why. They don't know why. They think it may have some autoimmune or some protective qualities, but they don't know why. Which means that every woman carries the DNA of not just, her mother, but her children. And that every child she has carries the DNA of her mother and the brothers and sisters that are before them, which means that we're like a kind of chimera. And I just found that so fascinating, because it explained to me how women often possess this kind of ESP when it comes to their children or their mothers or whatever, like, when something's maybe gone wrong or something's happening, or like I will often be like, oh, I'll be thinking about my mom or my sisters and they'll call, and it sort of led me into this. I was reading about women in adoption, and particularly women who had had forced adoptions in the 70s, these unwed mothers' homes and stuff, and how they were still suffering from PTSD years later, and in the forms of headaches or migraines or things they didn't understand that were happening on that child's birthday. And, years later, when they should have been forgetting about all this stuff, when they should have been putting these things behind them, and they just simply weren't. They could not move on. And I was wondering if, like, I was thinking of quantum entanglement, and that's where this idea of dangerous education came from. And the McCarthyism played into that, because, again, it was about people trying to control other people. And my sense has always been that the moment we start to do that, we lose. You don't know how many things may have been discovered or fixed or whatever, but weren't, because we have been so concentrated on keeping the people we don't feel are worthy down, or controlling them. Well, what I wanted was, women tend to have really intense relationships, especially young women. And I really wanted to get that across, like, because it's such an important part of being the age that these girls are. And, I think when you're these girls are like, what, 17, I think, and needing a mentor, needing someone to follow, and needing someone who you can be obsessed with. And I was thinking along the terms of sort of the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, how easy it is to be led astray, how easy it is to, when you have that kind of need to what's the word I want? to misunderstand what it is that's really going on. And, you know, young girls, young women have so much power and they don't know how to use it. And they use it sometimes in really bad ways. And if there's nobody there to sort of say, hey, wait, you know, look, if there's someone there who's not making the right choices, it's really easy for them to go wrong. And but that intensity is so fascinating, and it can be so overwhelming, and it can also be so productive and helpful. And I really wanted to make that point because, you know, because those relationships can be so important in a young woman's life and can be so important for later in life as well. And I've just felt it was really important to make that point. Glamorous Notions came from this idea that I was researching during a dangerous education, where I discovered that the CIA, which was just coming up after World War II, you know, other countries had their spy systems and stuff in place for years. So the CIA was just beginning, and they had a lot of making up to do. And they were, during the Cold War, using propaganda in culture to not just, you know, work against the Soviet Union, but also to convince, you know, Americans how they should be living their lives. And I just found that fascinating because they were using it in books, in music, in art, in movies. And I wanted to sort of take this intellectual idea, which was difficult because now, today, Americans sort of have a cynical view of the CIA. Like, we know all this, right? But back in the 50s, they did not. And they would have been, and they did become, you know, with the Pentagon Papers and all this stuff, completely horrified by the idea that the CIA was conducting all these sort of surreptitious and underground operations. But they would have been horrified by the idea that they were being manipulated by the CIA, which they absolutely were. You know, movies were being, you know, vetted by the CIA. They were being, you know, the sort of themes of the movies, producers and directors were being, you know, essentially, what's the word? They were themes and stuff were being directed by the CIA, and they had agents in the censor's office that were doing that. So Americans didn't know that. And I'm like, how do you get that? How do you take that, something that we know today, and sort of just assume, and how do you put it into the 50s and say, this is terrible? And how do you say, and that manipulation has determined how we think today, you know, like how we think about families, how we think about everything. It's still there today, and that's where it comes from. And so it was like, how do you combine this intellectual idea with a story? And that's where the plotting comes in, because that was the difficult part of Glamorous Notions. And it was difficult. It was like, so you have to take somebody who is involved in one of those artistic ventures in a way that you can show viscerally what is actually happening and how that character reacts to it and how it impacts them. And that was that, you know what, it was difficult. I mean, picking her out of the Midwest, which is for me always a fail-safe, because, you know, I'm from Ohio. So it's easy to pick that. Yeah, because what I wanted was for her not to understand what she was going into. It needed to be something, where she's so impacted by it, but she doesn't understand why, because it has to come back to sort of bite her later on, without spoiling anything. And it has to bite her through her career in Hollywood. And so that was all part of it. You know, I needed her to be um, complicit, and I needed her to be a little bit naive about that complicity. And I needed her to be in that way you are when you know that something is wrong and you don't really want to believe it. And so you aren't really asking questions. And so, and part of that is because, she meets Julia, this friend in Italy, who is so charismatic and who she so admires and who changes her life. And to ask questions about Julia means that she has to come to terms with things she suspects that she doesn't really want to know. And so that was, getting that balance right. Um, this is a book that went through many, many drafts, I can tell you. It was very much like, this sense of you come from somewhere and you have this ambition, but you don't really know what that ambition is. You don't know how to access it. You don't know how to form it. And then you meet somebody who teaches you kind of how to form it, how to be. And this is somebody you admire, somebody who you want to be. And she teaches you, she gives you the tools for being that person. And I think you just inhale it, you just say, this is who I want to be. It doesn't necessarily get rid of who you were, because that part is still in there, but it's not who you were isn't necessarily someone that you admire or like. And so, but there's still that place in there. There's still that insecure place in there. There's still that place that you can't quite get rid of, though what you've done now is said, okay, I'm going to be this new person. And this new person is going to be like this. But every now and then you have to kind of remind yourself, wait, I am this new person. I am no longer that old person. And so I liked that dichotomy, I liked playing with that.